Hi, I'm Don Smith. Welcome to Evangelize Me, the YouTube channel where you can learn more about your faith. And we're continuing our series today on preparing for the Advent, the second coming of Christ. This series, we looked at timelines, we've looked at the scriptures, we've looked at catechism, we looked at the rapture, we looked at what happens when Christ comes, we've looked at what needs to happen before Christ comes, and now we're digging into some of the truths that we need to know in case, we have to face some persecution at some point. And so, 2 weeks ago, we did this cosmic overview of Christ's victory over sin. And we looked at the scriptures that talk about him seated in heavenly places above every principality and every authority and every power. We looked at the fact that he has the name above all names and that every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. We looked at Revelation, where he arrives on a white horse that says King of Kings and Lord of Lords on his banner, and that he throws death and Satan and Hades into the lake of fire, and then establishes his kingdom for his bride. And so those are all like this cosmic, God is in charge, right? And so the last week, we looked at Romans chapter 8. And so the question was like, well, if God's in charge, then why are things still difficult? And we discovered from the Catechism a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas that says that God only allows evil in his creation if he is able to bring a greater good out of it. And then we looked at all of Romans 8, which is just full of these principles, how God demonstrates his power towards us by adopting us as his children, by making us co-heirs with Christ, by giving us all things, that who can bring a charge against God's elect, and who could condemn us, that all things work for good, and nothing can separate us from the love of God. And so we have these incredible promises. And so what we want to do this week is just dig down more, a little deeper into what these things mean, and especially apply them to our everyday, daily lives so that we are clear about how this stuff works. So we're going to begin in paragraph 303 of the Catholic Catechism. And it starts with, the witness of Scripture is unanimous that the solicitude of divine providence, the goodness of God's providence, is concrete and immediate. So several things there before we go on. The witness of Scripture is unanimous. That means there's not any contradicting scriptures. Like all the way through the scriptures, from beginning to end, there is only one theme. Sometimes there are things that seem to be contradictory to each other. Mercy and judgment. But there's nothing contrary to divine providence, right? It is thoroughly and completely established unanimously in the scriptures that God is in control. And that this control is concrete. In other words, it is real, right? It's not just a spiritual thing, but that it affects reality, and that it is immediate. That means there's no intermediaries. It comes directly from God. And then the paragraph continues, God cares for all, from the least things to the great events of the world and its history. And of course we see this in Scripture as well. We see not a sparrow falls that the Lord doesn't know about, and then we also see him intervening in battles on Israel's behalf. We see him intervening in raising up kings and deposing kings. But of course, right now I want to try to bring this down a little bit. And so God cares about the least things in your life. And in my life, he cares about things that are so small and insignificant that I wouldn't even pay attention to them. Like he counts the hairs on my head, right? And like, I don't care how many hairs are on my head, but it's just really the statement that he is so concerned about us. He loves us so much. He is so involved in everything. The scriptures say that Christ holds everything together, that he knows whenever every single hair that I lose, which follicle it came out of, right? And so from the least things to the greatest things, the deaths, the sufferings, the victories, the miracles, so, the new job, the new house, whatever it is, right? The big things in our lives, he's in charge of those too. And so the Catechism goes on in this same paragraph. It says, the sacred books powerfully affirm God's absolute sovereignty over the course of events. Did you catch that? Absolute sovereignty? Our God is in the heavens, and he does whatever he pleases. It's a quote from Psalm 115, which is pretty cool, right? Because it's basically, he can do whatever he wants. Nobody can stop him from accomplishing his will. And so it is with Christ, who opens and no one shall shut, and who shuts and no one opens. And as in the book of Proverbs, many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will be established. So now you think, okay, I make lots and lots of plans, and my plans don't always work out. Which is okay, right? I mean, I don't like it when my plans don't work out. But the important thing is that God's plans always works out. Because that's who he is. He establishes his will. So the Catechism illustrates this with the story of Joseph. And this isn't the story of Joseph, Jesus' father. It's the story of Jacob's son, Joseph, who is an Old Testament character. We find his story at the end of the book of Genesis. And it's quite a detailed story. It takes up several chapters. And we find his story, at the beginning of the story, that Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest ones, are from his last wife. And so they have a special place in Jacob's heart, but especially Joseph for some reason. And the scriptures say that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other sons, which means that Joseph grew up in a dysfunctional family, right? Because we know that when parents have favorites, that just makes a mess. It's not healthy, right? And it wasn't healthy in this family either. It says that Jacob gave Joseph a special cloak, and he didn't give any of his other sons a cloak, and so his brothers resented him. It says in one place in that story that his brothers could not even speak peaceably to him, which means that everything out of their mouths towards Joseph was hostile, right? I mean, this is a toxic environment. Now, I grew up with two big brothers, and big brothers can be a big pain, right? They like practical jokes. They like scaring people. They I could tell some stories, but my brothers loved me. Can you imagine having 10 older brothers who actually hated you? How miserable they could make your life, right? So this is Joseph's life. He's growing up. He's 17 years old when the story begins. And of course, Joseph doesn't help his situation very much, because at some point he has some dreams, and he tells the dreams to his brother. And one of the dreams is that they are going to bow down to him. And of course, you can imagine what their reaction was to that. And then Joseph has another dream where it's not just the brothers, but also the father who's going to bow down to him. And so when you got a little kid, right, of course he's 17 now, but when the older brothers would always consider him a kid, saying, I'm going to bow down to you, that'll never happen, right? And so that just increased their resentment. And so at the very beginning of the story, Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers. So the brothers are out tending flocks, and Joseph has a hard time finding them because they're moving around, and eventually he finds them, and his brothers see him coming from a distance, and they say, let's get rid of this dreamer once and for all. And so they try to figure out how they can kill him, right? And one of the brothers isn't comfortable with that idea. And says, hey, let's just throw him in a dry well. And he's thinking, I'll come back later and get him out, right? And so they do. They throw him, when he arrives, they put him in the bottom of a dry well, which would be a pretty terrifying event, having 10 people who hate you lower you into a deep hole in the ground that you can't climb out of. Now, I'm guessing Joseph, had thought, like, they're not really going to kill me because Dad would be devastated if they kill me. And so they're just being jerks, right? And so they're going to pull me out eventually. And we don't know how long he is down there. But this caravan comes by, and the brothers come up with this idea. It's like, hey, instead of just leaving him at the bottom of the well, why don't we pull him out and sell him as a slave? That way, at least we get a little money out of the deal, right? And so they do that. And so you can imagine Joseph down at the bottom of the well, and the rope comes down, and he's like, finally, the jerks are going to pull me out. Wait till Dad hears about this, right? And so they haul him up, and then he's sold as a slave to these foreigners. Now, the idea, of course, in the ancient world, you're sold as a slave. You're a slave for the rest of your life, right? And they take him to a foreign country. They take him to Egypt. And so he's in a foreign country. He's without his family. He's without any people. He's without any kind of support system. And his future is, I'm going to be a slave. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'd have a bad attitude. But apparently Joseph must have had a good attitude. He must have done something, because he worked his way up through the ranks of slaves until the person who bought him was one of the officers for Pharaoh. And he worked his way up through the slaves until he's in charge of all the slaves, right? And so he's the administrator of the household. He has the run of everything. The problem is that this officer's wife is attracted to him and keeps trying to seduce him. It says, day after day, she approached him. And one day, Joseph resists her attempts, right? Like, this would be a sin against God and against my master. And one day, they're alone in the house, and she grabs him, and he, in a struggle to get away, he leaves a garment behind. And so she is so mad that he has resisted her advances that she calls the security guards and says, that Hebrew slave tried to rape me. And so, of course, when the master gets home, he takes Joseph and throws him into prison. All right, so we're going from bad to worse now, right? We're a slave, and we're going to be a slave for the rest of our lives. Probably worked his way up, so his life is not too bad as a slave. But now he gets thrown into prison, and he's in prison because he's been falsely accused. He hasn't done anything wrong, but he's in a foreign prison, and there's not any kind of like justice system where it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to plead my cause. It's like, no, he's a slave. He doesn't have any rights, right? And so now he's in prison. And so for a period of time, he works his way up through the prison system. And eventually he becomes the prisoner who's in charge of all the other prisoners, which says something again about his work ethic, his attitude. And so he's in charge of all the other prisoners. And so the king, the Pharaoh, at some point gets mad at a couple of his servants, the cupbearer and the baker, and he throws them into this same prison. And while they're there, they both have a dream on the same night. And as Joseph is making his rounds, the baker and the cupbearer say, hey, we had these dreams. Do you think you could figure them out for us? Which is kind of interesting because his story starts with his own dreams, and then it continues with this dream theme, as we'll see. And so he listens to the cupbearer first, and his interpretation of the dream that the cupbearer had was, the king will restore you to your office in 3 days. And the baker is pretty encouraged, like, wow, that's good news, right? And so here, listen to my dream. And so he tells him his dream, and Joseph says, yeah, in 3 days you're going to get hanged, right? And so in 3 days, it happens just the way that Joseph said. And so the cupbearer is leaving prison now, and Joseph goes to him and says, hey, listen, I'm an innocent person. I don't belong here. You're going to be with Pharaoh. He's the only one who could get me out of here. Could you plead my case to him? Could you, bring me up? But it says the cupbearer never even called him to mind. So 2 years goes by. We don't know how long total he spent in prison, but it's a while, right? And so from the time he's 17, well, even before so he grows up in this toxic environment where he's hated, and then he gets sold as a slave, and then he gets wrongly accused and ends up in prison wrongfully and spends time in prison, a long time. And then And then, he has an opportunity to maybe hear his case get pleaded, and the person totally forgets about him. And so 2 more years goes by. And finally, Pharaoh has a dream. A couple of dreams, actually. And the first dream is that these 7 fat cows come out of the Nile River, and then 7 skinny cows come out of the Nile River, and the 7 skinny cows eat the fat cows. And then he has another dream where there's 7 fat heads of grain, and then 7 skinny shriveled up pieces of grain, and the 7 skinny shriveled up ones eat the fat ones. And so Pharaoh calls on all his magicians and wise men and priests, and no one can interpret the dream. And so finally the cupbearer says, geez, when I was in prison, there was this guy. So it's kind of interesting because they go and get Joseph out of prison, and they wash him and shave him and put him in clothes, good clothes, and bring him before Pharaoh. And so he listens to the dream, and he says, oh, that means that for 7 years, there's going to be great prosperity, great crops. And then there's going to be a famine for 7 years. And the famine is going to eat up all the prosperity of the first 7 years. And because you had the same dream twice, that means it is established. It's definitely going to happen. And what you need to do is during the 7 good years, store as much grain as you possibly can, so that you can survive the 7 years of famine. And the king, the Pharaoh, is so impressed that he says, you're the man. You do that. And so he names Joseph to be basically the prime minister. He, dresses him in fancy clothes, gives him a chariot, rides him through the street, heralds him as, this new prime minister. And he works for the next 7 years, collecting grain in every city, building huge storehouses of grain. In fact, it says he collected so much grain that they couldn't keep track of it anymore. And then the famine begins. And the famine isn't just in North Africa, but it's also in the Middle East and all the surrounding areas. And as the famine continues, the entire nation, and in fact, the entire Middle East, there's no food except in Egypt, right? And so Joseph is distributing food and making Pharaoh rich by selling food. And in Canaan, Judah's family runs out of food. And so he turns to his sons, and he says to his sons, you need to get into Egypt. That's the only place to get food. Here's some gold. Go on down and, buy some grain and bring it back. So the 10 sons go down to Egypt. And when they appear before Joseph, it says that Joseph's first response, he had to leave the room and go and weep, because he recognizes them immediately, but of course they don't recognize him. They're not expecting to see him again, right? And then he comes out and questions them. Don't you have more brothers? Yes, we have 2 more brothers. One is no longer with us, and the other is our elderly father's pride and joy. Well, how is your father? Is he in good health, right? And so he asks all these questions, and then he sells them the grain. But he says, listen, I don't think you're telling me the whole truth. I think you're lying to me. I think you're actually spies, and that what you want to do is steal grain from me. And so I'll give you grain this time, but don't come back here unless you bring your youngest brother, Benjamin, and then I'll know that you're telling me the truth. The brothers didn't like that, of course, but then they take the grain. They're happy to get the grain. They leave Egypt. And at some point on the journey way back, they discovered that the gold that they had paid for the grain, Joseph had an officer put it into the grain sacks. So each son, when he opened the sack of grain that he had bought, the gold that he had used to pay for the grain was in the sack. And they were like, oh my gosh, this is a terrible accident, right? Like something awful must have happened. And he's going to think we stole the grain now, right? But there's nothing they can do about it. So they continue on. And they get home, eventually they eat all the food. And so Jacob says to him, hey, listen, you got to get into Egypt again. And the sons are like, no, we can't go back unless we bring Benjamin. And he says, oh, you can't take Benjamin. If anything happens to him, I'd die. And so they have this big discussion, and finally it's like, okay, we'll take Benjamin with us. And so they go down and they appear before Joseph again, and Joseph sees Benjamin for the first time, and he goes back into his room and cries. He never thought he'd see his younger brother again, right? And then he comes out and he clears the court, except for the brothers, and he reveals himself to them. And it says that he fell on Benjamin's neck and wept loudly, right? And he cries, hugging each brother. And of course, they're shocked. What the heck? How is Joseph in charge of the nation of Egypt, right? And so they're reunited, and eventually Jacob, they go home, they get Jacob, they bring him back, and that's how they get established in Egypt. So the Catechism, the scriptures tell us something really interesting about Joseph's interpretation of his life and what he says to his brothers about what they did to him. And so it says in paragraph 312, in time, we can discover that God, in his almighty providence, can bring good from the consequences of an evil, even a moral evil, caused by his creatures. See, that's Romans 8:28, right? He can bring good out of anything, all things, even something is morally evil. It was not you, Joseph said to his brothers, who sent me here, but God. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people would be kept alive. So first of all, I just want you to notice these words, right? It's obviously Joseph's brothers who sent him to Egypt, right? They're the ones who sold him into slavery. And yet Joseph's perspective is that it wasn't them that sent him into slavery. It was God who sent him into slavery. That what they meant for evil, they were trying to destroy him and get rid of him, God had used for good, not only for Joseph, but for the entire nation and surrounding nations, and especially for his own family, right? And so you look at this and you think, without God's intervention in this situation, then like all of history would be different because of this event. And so God is working even, he can bring good even out of something that is evil. Now I want you to notice that it says, in time we can discover, right? That means when we're going through it, we have no idea what's going on, right? When Joseph is sold as a slave, when he's falsely accused and thrown into prison, he has no idea what God is doing. He can't see how God is ever going to bring good out of this. It just is terrible in lots of different ways, over and over and over. And yet God is working in all of those situations to place Joseph exactly where he needs to be so that he can accomplish his purposes of saving the nation and saving his family. So it goes on, from the greatest moral evil ever committed, the rejection and murder of God's only Son, caused by the sins of all men, God, by his grace that abounded all the more, brought the greatest of goods, the glorification of Christ and our redemption. From the greatest evil ever created, God created the greatest of goods. Because that's who he is. That's what he does. That's why he is our Redeemer. Because he redeems us in our sinfulness, in our weakness, in our foolishness, redeems us and makes us his own children, the centerpieces of his plan. And so it concludes this section. I think it's the conclusion. Let's see whether there's another slide. We firmly believe that God is the master of the world and its history. But the ways of his providence are often unknown to us. Only at the end, when our partial knowledge ceases, when we see God face to face, will we fully understand and fully know, the ways by which, even through the dramas of evil and sin, God has guided his creation to that definitive Sabbath rest for which he created heaven and earth. So I want to just tell you a couple of stories, right? Just to illustrate this idea that God is the master of the world, and he brings good. Well, first of all, it reminds me of Bishop Barron was teaching about evil at one point, and he said, really our lives are like a tapestry, and from this side, all we can see is the backside of the tapestry, which has lots of loose ends and disorganized colors, and there's no patterns, and there's nothing beautiful about it at all. But that when we get to heaven, we're going to see how God wove it all together, all the circumstances and situations and decisions and people involved and all of that stuff. He has wove it into this beautiful tapestry. And we're going to be amazed at what he has done with our lives. And so, years and years and years ago, my brother Daryl was getting married, and he was getting married on July 6th. And Hollis and I lived in upstate New York, and we looked at our finances, and it was his second marriage, and it was an outdoor wedding. It wasn't going to be a big deal, and so it was sort of like, you don't have to come, right? And so as the time approached, we were like, well, we really can't afford to go. And then at the last minute, it was like, okay, let's go. Let's be adventurous. And the fastest way to get from upstate New York to the very northern part of Maine where this wedding was taking place is to go through Canada. But going through Canada on the Queen's Highway, you have to go through Toronto. And going through Toronto during the day is just a nightmare. And so we decided, let's just drive all night. We'll leave on July 3rd, and we'll drive all night, and we'll surprise everybody by being at the camp on July 4th, right? Great plan. So I did most of the driving and got up into the northern part of Canada, and I got tired driving, so Hollis took over, and I was sleeping in the passenger seat, and I woke up, and we were on a dirt road, which I thought was rather strange, and she said, I found a shortcut, and so I unbuckled my seatbelt, and I was putting my seat up, and we were, still a couple hours away, and we were on this dirt road in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the woods, and we come over the crest of a hill, right? And at the same time that we come up over the crest of this hill, a pickup comes over the crest of the hill from the other side. We didn't see each other until, we were hitting each other. He was a woodcutter on his way to work, 5 o'clock in the morning. We hit head on, both cars totaled. His pickup's totaled, our car's totaled. Ambulance attendants don't speak French. Police people don't speak French. It was a mess. Hollis hit more on Hollis's side. She's all black and blue. I wasn't strapped in, so I broke the windshield with my head. It was a pretty major accident. And I found myself thinking about it, and I realized, Lord, one red light. That's all it would have taken. Just 10 seconds. 10 seconds, he would have been at the top of the hill, and we would have seen him before we got there, right? That's all we needed. Just like one slow car in front of us that we couldn't pass for a minute, right? Literally seconds. It had to be split-second timing for us to meet at this blind hill at 5 o'clock in the morning in Canada, right? It's ridiculous how bizarre this accident is. But it says, we firmly believe that God is the master of the world. He allowed that to happen for some reason. I don't know what the reason was, right? But how many times do we have weird little coincidences? How many times do we, make spur-of-the-minute decisions that we're not even sure why we're choosing them, and they turn out to be incredibly significant in our lives, sometimes very positively, sometimes very negatively, right? How often do weird little things happen that if you think about them statistically speaking, it's like it's almost impossible that this would happen this way, right? Almost impossible. God works in every situation. Let me tell you another story. I was hiking in northern Maine. I love hiking in remote areas and camping in remote areas. And there's places in northern Maine where there's these dirt roads. They're owned by a conglomeration of paper company lands, and so you have to pay to use them. But then you can drive like 2 or 3 hours over dirt roads into the middle of nowhere. There's no towns. There's no gas stations. There's no stores. There's nothing out there. It's just all woods and rivers and ponds. And there's campsites maintained out there, and so I go out and I get a campsite on this pond, and I have the place all to myself, and it's just beautiful. It's a little rainy when I set up, and then the next morning I get up and I drive to the where the Appalachian Trail crosses the road, not too far away, and I wanted to hike that particular section because it's a steep ravine with a river in the bottom, and you hike along the river and then you hike up the cliff so that you're at the top of the ravine and you can look down at the river at the bottom. It was a nice little hike. It was beautiful views, really fun. But there were people on the trail, and my whole point in being out there was to be away from people. I just want to be left alone. So when I came back down off the ravine and got down to the river, I thought, geez, I want to hike up the river. There's no trail there. I'm just going to go bushwhacking, but I can't get lost because if I don't leave the river, I just follow the river up, right? So that's pretty safe as long as I don't fall down and break my leg. If I do that, then they'll probably never find me, right? Because who's going to be looking out in the middle of nowhere where there's no trails? And so I take off up the river, and I go. It's all big boulders, and they're all covered with moss, and so it's slippery, and you kind of have to be careful. And I get about a quarter mile up the river, quite a ways off the Appalachian Trail. And I see someone sitting by the river. And my first thought was like, oh, come on, Lord. Like, I just want to be alone, right? But as I'm approaching, I realize, like, wow, he has boots on and he has his feet in the river. That's kind of weird. And then as I get closer, I realize he's laying on his side and he has his backpack on. And then as I get closer, I realize, gosh, he's not, like, he's older than I am, right? And so I come up to him and say, like, are you okay? And he says, no. He said, I left the trail last night. It was raining, and I must have missed the turn. And he said the ground was so rough, I kept falling down, and I couldn't see. And he said, I fell into the river and almost drowned. And he said, I just barely got myself out. And he said, I can't get my backpack off. So he had dragged himself out of the river, but he couldn't do anything else. And so I unstrapped his backpack. And when I went to pick it up, he had a down sleeping bag and all his clothes and his tent and everything. The pack must have weighed 150, 200 pounds, right? And so I get it off him, and I get him up out of the river, and he's pretty disoriented. He had spent the night, he'd fallen in the river and spent the night laying there with his feet in the river with this huge backpack sopping wet on him. So I say, listen, stay right here. So I carry his backpack back to the trail. That was quite a little project. Come back, I get him, help him get back to the trail. I set up his tent, put up a clothesline, put all his clothes on it, cook a little thing of water so that he can have some soup and some coffee. And as I'm doing that, he looks at me and he says, do you believe in God? And I was like, yeah, I do. And he said, God sent you. I never would have made it if you didn't come save me. And he was right, of course, right? That it was just on a whim, like that it was a whim that I happened to be there. It was a whim that I decided, hey, that wasn't my plan. I was just like, hey, I wonder what's up the river. Nobody ever goes up there. Maybe there's some cool stuff up there. We never know, right? We don't know. But when we have little events like that, we discover, wow, God is using my circumstances and my situations and the desires of my heart and my thoughts and sometimes even my fears and everything. He's using everything to put me in places where he wants me. Which is pretty exciting when you think about it. So when you think about God wanting to reveal himself. God has a sense of humor. So we have this beautiful granddaughter. She's 10 years old. And I save my silver coins in a piggy bank, and I throw my pennies in a jar. And we had moved, and so I didn't have a jar, so I just putting all my change in the piggy bank. But I don't like that. I'm kind of weird, and so she comes over at some point, and I say, hey, listen, I got a job for you. I want you to empty the piggy bank and take all the pennies out of it and put it in the jar, and then put the change back into the piggy bank. And she's like, okay. And so the way she decides to do it, she empties the piggy bank on the floor, and she takes a handful of them. And then she takes all the pennies out and makes a pile of pennies and a pile of nickels and a pile of dimes and a pile of quarters. And then she counts each one, which I thought, I don't care if you count them. And you don't have to sort them, right? I just want pennies and silver. But whatever. She's having fun. I'm reading my book. And so she does that. 3 handfuls, 3 columns of coins. And then she says, Grampy, this is weird. I said, why? What's weird? She said, well, the first handful had 10 pennies in it. And the second handful had 11 pennies in it. And the third handful had 12 pennies in it. Isn't that funny? And so I said, yes, well, what are the chances of that? The chances of getting 10, 11, and 12 pennies in 3 consecutive, that's not going to happen, right? That's God, right? So God's with you right now. He's showing you that he's with you. And, we've been having these conversations. She's just like, wow, that's cool. And so she takes up another handful and she's puts them all out, and then she starts counting them. And I go back to my book, and then she starts laughing. And she's, Grampy, you're not going to believe this. That handful had 13 pennies in it. And I said, no way. And she said, it did. She said, God is playing with me. And what a beautiful image, right, of the Lord in his love, delighting to be with his children, delighting to reveal himself. And that's part of this message. It's like that we can look for God. We can be with God every moment of our day. So how often am I in a hurry and I have a plan and a red light, and it's like, oh, I'm going to be late. And I have to remind myself, no, God is the master of my life. My wife sings this song, I forgot what it's called, but there's a line in it that says, love rules the universe, right? Love is the ruler of my universe. Love is the ruler of my life. And so if I have a red light, it's like, okay, God has a good reason to give me a red light. Like, he's not just jerking my chain. He's not being mean to me. He loves me. And so if I have a red light, then it's a good thing. Right? And it's the same whether they're big things or little things. And when you begin to become aware of this presence of God all the time, and you realize everything is something that he is accomplishing in us, then it changes your whole perspective of everything. So I hate going to Walmart, right? I just don't like the store. I don't like the whole consumerism thing. I don't like, all of that stuff. But sometimes you just have to go. And usually my mentality is like, I'm going to get in and out as fast as I can. I'm just purely functioning. But sometimes when I go in, it strikes me, the humanity strikes me. The weird hair colors and the weird tattoos and the immodesty and it's just like, oh my gosh, these hurting people. And so I find myself, oh Lord, have mercy on that person. Lord, help them to know how much they are loved and cared for. Help them discover your grace and find salvation. Oh Lord, I lift up that family. They obviously hate each other and they're not getting along. Please help them. Lord, intervene. Do something that would bring something positive into each and every one of their lives. And so as I'm going through the store, I find myself interceding for every person I'm meeting. And then eventually it becomes overwhelming. And it's like, Lord, I just lift up every person in this store and ask that you bring them to salvation. Help them to know you. Help them to know how powerful and loving and good you really are. When I leave, I feel like, wow, that was a missionary spiritual warfare adventure going in there. What I had to buy didn't matter at all. What mattered was that I went in with God and and had his point of view. So this is the perspective that many of the saints encourage us to have. So St. Catherine of Siena said to those who were scandalized and rebel against what happens to them, right? Did you ever get rebel against what happens to you? Like you get angry because of the circumstances in your life. You get angry because of, so you're rebelling against what happens to you. And her advice was, everything comes from love. All is ordained for the salvation of men. God does nothing without this goal in mind. Everything comes from love. Let me tell you just one more story, and then I promise I won't tell you any more stories. My wife and I had a mobile home that we rented, and the people that were renting it from us called us and said something must be wrong because it smells like sewage in the trailer, which is never a good sign, right? And so it's like, oh, that's bad. So I go down and I'm hoping, hopefully it's something underground, because then it would be the people who own the land are responsible for anything underground. So if it's the septic system's overflowing, then that's their problem. But as soon as I take the skirting off, I can see that there's a pipe broken, right? And the pipe is up in the air, it's not in the ground. And that sewage has been dumping on the ground underneath the trailer for who knows how long, right? So you can imagine how gross this is. And then, of course, the space is about 1.5 feet that you have to crawl in to this mess, and it is full of spiders. So, this is for me, this is like the worst case scenario. It smells, it's gross, there are spiders, and it's a small space, right? And so I'm in there, and I'm scooping dirt out and dragging it out and dumping and then crawling back under to get more dirt. And I had a moment of grace. I just had a moment of grace where I thought, God loves me. He loves me all the time, and he only does the best for me. I'm his son. He loves me. He would not do this unless it was the very best thing for me. He only does the very best things for me. He's doing this, he's allowing this because he loves me. Completely transformed that whole experience. Completely transformed it where I was with the Lord underneath that trailer. Everything comes from love. St. Thomas More, shortly before his martyrdom, consoled his daughter, "Nothing can come but that God wills." And I make me very sure that whatsoever that be, seem it never so bad in sight, it shall indeed be the best. So nothing can come except for God's will, and it is indeed the best. Julian of Norwich says, "Here I was taught by the grace of God that I should steadfastly keep me in the faith, and that at the same time I should take my stand on and earnestly believe in what our Lord showed in this time, that all manner of thing shall be well." All manner of things. Jean-Pierre was a priest, a Jesuit priest in France in the 1700s. He wrote this spiritual classic called Abandonment to Divine Providence. He expressed it this way: "Never lose sight of the great and consoling truth that nothing happens in this world but by the command of God, or at least with his divine permission, and that whatever he wills or permits turns infallibly to the advantage of those who are submissive and resigned." Nothing happens except by God's permission or command, and whatever he wills or permits infallibly, unfailingly works to our advantage. Now I'm going to tell you, believing this in difficult situations. My illustrations have been silly in some ways. But when you've lost someone, when there's been a tragedy, when there's been a miscarriage, when there's been a terrible accident, this is incredibly hard to receive, right? It's incredibly hard to trust God under those circumstances, and it takes time, and there's a process, and you need to be patient. I'm not saying this is easy at all, no, not even a little bit. And so, but the testimony of the Catechism and the Scriptures and the saints shows that this is the path, right, of finding healing and peace. So there's one more person I want to introduce you to, and it's Blessed Chiara. She was a young lady in Italy who, I should have looked up the year she died. It's not very long ago. And she was 15 years old and playing tennis when she had sharp pain in her shoulder that didn't go away. And so they took her to the hospital thinking, maybe she tore a ligament or something like that. And they did x-rays and discovered that she had a rare form of painful bone cancer. And so began this journey of, chemotherapy and all of this stuff. And there's pictures of her in hospital bed with no hair. And she always has this incredible smile on her face and sparkle in her eye. And this is one of her quotes, which is pretty famous. If you want it, Jesus, so do I. If you want it, Jesus, so do I. That is a hard thing to say, right? And she fought her cancer for 3 years, and she died when she was 18. But she was incredibly joyful. Even, she'd been very involved in youth ministry in her diocese, and her bishop came to visit her, and her bishop said that she was one of the most joyful people in her process of dying that he had ever encountered, right? And so you think about her faith and the difference that it made in her experience. So there's another story in the Scriptures about someone who is providentially where they belong when they're supposed to be there, and that is the story of Esther. And Esther is a young lady. She's being raised by her uncle, and they're Jewish people, and they're in the exile in Babylon. The king of Babylon gets angry at his wife because she won't obey him, and so he deposes her and needs a new wife, and so a new queen, and so he sends out emissaries to all the major cities to find the most beautiful young virgins and brings them back to the palace. And they go through this year-long process of preparing to be presented to the king. And out of all the young women who get brought in, Esther is chosen to be the queen. And meanwhile, as she's this new queen, the prime minister, who underneath the king, absolutely hates her uncle, and so he comes up with this plan that the Jews should be eradicated, and he convinces the king to that they're disrupting the country because they won't worship our gods. And so he has a decree written, and the king signs it, that says all the Jews are to be executed on this certain date. And so the uncle comes to Esther and says, you need to do something. And she says, what can I do? Like, if you can't enter the king's presence without being called, or else they can kill you. I mean, the only thing that could save me is if the king extended his scepter to me. And so, so he says this to her. He said, perhaps you were born for such a time as this. So she, calls for a fast. She goes in. He extends the scepter to her. There's a long story short. God intervenes by keeping the king awake one night, and everything gets turned around so that the prime minister ends up getting hanged instead of her uncle, and the Jews are saved. Perhaps you were born for such a time as this. God knows what's going to happen, the beginning from the end, right? And so he's not surprised when the events of history happen. In fact, he prepares for it. So when you look at, there's some saints that are called counter-Reformation saints. So the Reformation, of course, happened in 1517. It's you know the story of Martin Luther. He has these 95 theses. It starts out as a theological debate about indulgences and lots of other things, and it quickly devolves into this political battle. And so that when Martin Luther is brought before a council and has a chance to defend what he's been teaching, the council, decide, no, what you're teaching is heresy, and so you have to, stop teaching this. Well, Europe was united at that point in what's called the Holy Roman Empire, and Charlemagne was the king of this Holy Roman Empire, and he was in Spain fighting the Muslims that had invaded Spain. So he's a long ways away, right? And the prince in Germany had long wanted to break away from the Holy Roman Empire, to come out from underneath Charlemagne's reign and be a king himself. And so what he did was kidnap Martin Luther and take him to a palace and provide him with a way where he could write these pamphlets about what he's teaching and distribute them to the masses. And that is how the Reformation began to spread, right? And so it's interesting. You can read Protestant history of the Reformation, and you can read Catholic history of the Reformation, but it's interesting to read secular accounts of the Reformation, because those tend to focus more on the political issues, and you get the impression this is really more of a political movement, right? It was these princes and these rulers who wanted to come out from underneath Charlemagne's reign, who used the Protestant movement as the means to do that. And so it's a terrible thing, right? A huge division in the church. And there were some people who rose up in the Catholic faith who did a tremendous job of stopping the flow of the Protestant movement, keeping it from taking over France and Spain, and keeping it out of Italy, right? And so these leaders, it's kind of interesting to look at some of these leaders, and they're not just leaders in Europe. I mean, Juan Diego, at the same time the Reformation's taking place, he's has this this vision of not obviously not at the same time period of the Lady of Guadalupe, and millions of Mexicans, right, come to faith in Christ. And then Thomas More, who resisted the Reformation in England, standing up against the king who wanted to take the country and make himself the leader of the church. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, who sent hundreds of missionaries all around the world to proclaim the gospel and taught the faith strongly in France. Peter Faber, Francis Xavier, a famous evangelist, Peter Faber, who helped Ignatius. Philip Neri started a whole movement in Italy of building Christian communities that were about faith formation. Teresa of Avila, who led the reforms in the Carmelites. And you notice that all of them are born before the Reformation, right? It's like the Lord knows what he needs and who he needs, and places them in time, places them in history where he wants them, where they can be used for his kingdom. Now, I just want to propose to you, and of course, after the Reformation, you have St. John of the Cross and Francis de Sales, you have a whole bunch of others. But I just want to point out to you that, as a result of this class, I hope that you have a sense of we're living in really unique times where God is going to raise up saints to accomplish his will. And I just want to ask you this question, or make this statement to you. Perhaps you were born for such a time as this. And of course, it isn't a perhaps. God saw you before he created anything, right? That's what Paul says in Ephesians 1. He had you in mind before he created anything. He knew exactly when you'd be born and what family you'd be born in, what circumstances you'd be raised. He knew all about your heart's desires. He knew about your struggles and your pains. He knows everything. He orchestrates every little detail in your life to have you in the place where he needs you and wants you for your good and for the good of his kingdom. We can trust him so that when times are hard, we can know I'm exactly where I belong. And God is doing an amazingly good thing in me as a result. Even if it's evil, even if it's persecution, even if it's done by evil people, God is for me. He's not against me. Nothing is going to separate me from his love. And he is going to work for my advantage, for my good, all things. God bless you. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you've been blessed. Join me for one more video in this series. Next week, we'll be talking about I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ.